Welcome to Burkina Faso. I am Nicole,
I am Michael.
and Maffer. And
Today we will be comparing the proportion of the population using improved drinking water sources to the GDP per capita. Now we will be giving you some background info on Burkina Faso. It has a population of 16.93 million.
People. Their major languages are French and indigenous languages.
The life expectancy is around 56 years.
The currency is CFA, which stands for Communauté Financière Africaine franc.
The poverty rate is of 44.6%.
Some facts are that 80% of the population are farmers.
It used to be a French colony and it gained independence as Upper Volta in 1960.
The Northland is extremely dangerous with kidnappings and threat of terrorism by terror groups from Mali and Niger.
Most people earn less than 1.25 US dollars per day.
The variables for our country, Burkina Faso, are the independent variable is the GDP per capita. The dependent variable is the proportion of the population using improved water sources. The lurking variable, the density of the population, the scarcity of resources, and the country being landlocked has caused the people from Burkina Faso to live in really poor conditions. That is why not many people have improved water sources and also why they have one of the lowest GDP per capita. Also, Burkina Faso goes through many natural disasters, mostly droughts, which is why the percent of the population using improved water sources is so low. This is the bubble chart for our data of Burkina Faso. In the y-axis, we have the percent of the population using improved water sources, and in the x-axis, we have the GDP per capita. As you notice, for Burkina Faso, the GDP per capita barely changes over the years, but the improved water sources do increase significantly, similar to India's situation. Compared to India, which is a light blue bubble, Burkina Faso's population, which is a dark bubble, is much smaller, as you can see by India's bubble size. This is because in Burkina Faso, they have an infant mortality rate of 70 per 1,000 babies born, while in India, that number is 44 per 1,000 babies.
The GDP per capita in Burkina Faso is so low and doesn't change significantly because Burkina Faso used to be a colony of France and it only became independent in 1960 and it became known as Ultra Volta. Then it changed its name to Burkina Faso, which is named for honorable people. Although its name is honorable people, it is actually a really corrupt country because it came into the hands of very powerful men and soldiers who took advantage of the people's poverty. That's why people are not able to improve their living standards, and that is why the GDP per capita hasn't really changed that much over the past years.
Data from 1990 to 2010 of the proportion of the population using improved drinking sources is shown. It is a very symmetrical and normal graph, since the data didn't change that much or dramatically between dates.
Because of this, there were no outliers in our data. The median is 60, which means that it is the number in between all of our data. The first quartile is 50, while the third one is 70.5, and the data ranges all the way from a low of 43% in 1990 to a high of 79% in 2010.
The interquartile range is 20.5, which is the distance between the median and the first quartile and from the median and the third quartile.
Finally, the standard deviation of this data was 11.29, which means that 68% of the data falls between 48.71 and 71.39, slowly spreading out more and more.
This is the frequency distribution graph for the proportion of the population using improved drinking water sources. The x-axis represents the proportion of the population using improved drinking water sources, and the y-axis represents the frequency from which the population has the improved water sources.
So, for example, from the range of 43 to 47%, it means that for 4 years, from 1990 to 1994, 43 to 47% of the population in Burkina Faso had improved drinking water sources. Since the frequency graph goes up to 4, that means that they in those ranges for they had those ranges for 4 consecutive years.
Another example is from 53 to 57%, which means that for 3 years, because the frequency graph goes up to 3, from 1996 to 1999, 53 to 57% of Burkina Faso's population have had improved drinking water sources. The lowest score is 43%. That means that in 1990, 43% of the population had improved drinking water sources, and the highest score is 79, which means that in 2010, 79% of the population had improved drinking water sources.
Unlike the previous box plot, this box plot is skewed to the lower numbers. One whisker is larger than the other, however, there were no outliers. The median for this data, or the GDP per capita of Burkina Faso, is 10,057, and the data ranges from a low of 821 in 1990 to a high of 14,331 in 2010. The interquartile range is 381, meaning that the first quartile is 870.5 and the third one is 1251.5%. And finally, the standard deviation of this data is 189.088, meaning that 68% of the data falls between 867.912 and 12,046.088.
This is the frequency distribution graph for the GDP per capita in Burkina Faso. The x-axis represents the GDP per capita in a certain year. So, for example, from the range of 821 to 920, Burkina Faso's GDP per capita was around those numbers for 6 consecutive years, from 1990 to 1996. We can see this because in that range, the frequency graph goes up to 6. So the GDP happened for 6 years. From the GDP per capita of 1,421 to 1,521, the GDP per capita was only in that range for 1 year in 2010. We can see this because the graph goes up to 1. Since it only goes up to... Hi, puta, voy a volver a empezar. This is the frequency distribution graph for the GDP per capita in Burkina Faso. The x-axis represents the GDP per capita in a certain year. So, for example, from the range of 821 to 920, Burkina Faso's GDP per capita was around those numbers for 6 consecutive years, from 1990 to 1996. We can see this because the graph goes up to the number 6. So that means that GDP per capita happened 6 times. And since GDP is accounted year-round, it happened for 6 consecutive years.
From the GDP per capita of 1,421 to 1,521, their GDP per capita was only in that range for 1 year in 2010, which is the last year of our dataset. We can see this because it goes up to 1.
The highest score is 1,431, which means that was the GDP per capita in 2010, since 2010 is the last year in our data, and the lowest score is 821, which happened in 1990 because it's the first year in our data.